So guess who forgot season 2 of Castlevania Nocturne is coming out on the 16th. Guess that's what happens when you're busy prepping for an evacuation, but let's get into today's analysis. Featuring the pretty boy with magical ED. The difference between Richter Belmont and the other Belmonts is that he is a boy and all of the others are men. If we don't take his original character design from the games into consideration, which just looks like a testosterone-addled version of Richter Belmont, this take on Richter is supposed to portray him as a very sensitive boy who is trying to get over the trauma of watching his mother die, which hamstrings him considerably because he doesn't have access to 90% of his skill set, that being magic. Blue is a color that normally symbolizes sadness and calm, but in Castlevania specifically, it symbolizes magic. Now, because Richter is coming from a point in the Belmont bloodline that has been influenced by Sypha, therefore all of them become great magic users, Richter is portrayed as a slim yet athletic boyish man who relies less on brute strength and defense and more on magic and agility, much like Sypha. So because of that, even though he does have an inverted triangle silhouette, which is why he has a tapered small waist and wide shoulders, Richter has much more effeminate facial features such as long lashes, a small chin, pouty lips, and a narrow nose, and large, round, expressive eyes. Honestly, I believe this was done to signify that Richter takes after his mother the most out of all of the Belmonts, thus making him a bona fide mama's boy. I said what I said. But getting down to the brass tacks of things, I do like how this is translated into his uniform, where instead of being some type of like heavy layered military coat adjacent uniform, some type of sleeveless vest tunic like Trevor here, which shows off his big muscles in order to make his silhouette and body larger, as we can see from the pointed collar. Richter's outfit is much more focused on looking as slim and fitted as possible, as we can see from his collars folded downward and the lapel. Even though he does have some leather accessories to offer protection, such as his leather pauldrons, his elbow-length gloves, and his waist belt, it's depicted in these straight lines that conform to his natural body shape and doesn't flare out like the fur lining of Trevor's accessory. This is a theme that is maintained to the tails of his coat, his white trousers, and his slim-fitted boots. And even his messy brown tousled hair does a really good job of carrying this theme because it's cut short in order to conform to the natural shape of his face. The white headband, which obviously is a callback to his original design in the Castlevania games and is also an indicator of one's fighting spirit per Japanese language, does a really good job of adding additional details to a design without weighing it down. It's very clear that Richter's depiction is supposed to signal a new era in Castlevania and the Belmont line. I mean, because this TV adaptation does take place well over a century after the original TV adaptation, I can see why the character designers for the TV show wanted to go for a more sorrowful yet spunky and naive take on the average Belmont vampire hunter. And again, I can't get over how much of an influence Sypha had on this bloodline because the color palette is now mainly blue and white in comparison to black, red, and gold. And yeah, that's it for today's character design analysis. Since the fires have kind of calmed down around my area, I'm gonna keep trying to post more of these analysis up until the release of season 2, possibly a little bit after, depending on what characters you guys want me to analyze. So comment down below and I'll see you guys next time. TikTok is almost gone, but the show must go on, so I'm back again with another character design analysis for the cast of Castlevania Nocturne, featuring the girl going through the worst life. And even though season 2 finally dropped, I don't know if everybody here knows the spoiler, so I'm gonna shut the fuck up. What you need to know about Maria is that she's dressed in a very whimsical style that's reminiscent of French Rococo. And if you don't know anything about French Rococo, personally, it's one of my favorite aesthetic movements. It's basically this very charming, whimsical, fantastical fairy tale aesthetic that's characterized by natural swooping line work, kind of like Art Nouveau, except it's softer and usually the color palette is pastel. Much like Maria's color palette, which is made up of pink, some red, teal, white, and then blonde. Her clothing is interestingly boyish, which adds this kind of like androgynous charm to her, even though her physical characteristics are supposed to make her look like a doll since she has soft porcelain skin, these large, vivid green eyes with full lashes, and long blonde wavy hair that's curled at the end and tied in a green bow. Getting back to her boyish aesthetic, she has a style that's mostly found with French fashion for men, as we can see from the fact that she's wearing a doble, which is a type of short jacket, and are more commonly worn by men than they are women. Eventually, women did catch on to that style. And it's paired up with rhinegraves, otherwise known as breeches, which are also known as a pair of short cropped pants that men used to wear. They typically end at the knee because men typically wore this with tights, much like what Maria is doing right now, or a pair of heels with a buckle, as we can see here. Well, obviously there are more girlish elements, as we can see from her waist sash that's tied up like a ribbon, the long pointed collar with the ruffle frills. And despite this being men's fashion, the litany of feminine qualities is par for the course for Rococo, As we've already established with the frills and the ribbons, they're done up in a way where it has the sweeping lines that are common in Rococo, and the springtime color palette brings this youthful jubilance to Maria's aesthetic, which stands out against the gory and grim-dark aesthetic of Castlevania, painting her as this kind of untarnished innocence, which is even more obvious by the way she's posed here, because she looks off to the side kind of like a mischievous little pixie, with her hair and her sash being on opposite sides of her body, and makes her tiny body look even smaller in comparison. The surprising thing I discovered about Maria is that she has one of the most faithful and unchanged designs. We went through this with Richter and Trevor. They went through some type of change through the adaptation, and the opposite is true for Maria, who looks like a circus performer meets Disney princess. The original art style exaggerates her eyes more, where they kind of look big and glassy like an actual doll, so it makes her come off kind of doe-eyed and ditzy. And her frame is made to look even smaller with the way that she's standing on her tiptoes, which to me makes her come off as more of a passive character. I'm not quite sure what her arc is like in this game because I never got to play it. So overall, I think that in Castlevania Nocturne, they were trying to give Maria more of a character arc and purpose in the story, rather than a whimsical mage who can summon animals and speak to animals. And yeah, that's it for today's character design analysis. I'm just trying to get back into the swing of things. I'm not feeling too hot, but we will be covering Annette next time. So if TikTok hasn't been killed off, I hope I'll see you guys there. And just like the 1% of bacteria that survived your hand sanitizer, TikTok is back again. So I'm back with another character design analysis for the cast of Castlevania Nocturne, featuring the girl who's literally been in this fight since she was 6 years old. Annette is a significant departure from her original appearance in Castlevania. Not only was her race and overall appearance changed, but also her role. Yes, she is still Richter's love interest, but she takes on less of a damsel in distress and more of a freedom fire boss bitch. So Annette takes on a lot of inspiration from Yoruba and Haitian culture. To start, she takes on a lot of the physical qualities of an Afro-Caribbean woman. She has the short, kinky coiled hair, which is woven into tight locks with golden tips, a significant departure from when she was dressed in tatters as a slave girl, and she wasn't able of wearing her hair proudly with any type of adornment. She is dark-skinned with a wide nose, full lips, and she even wears a waist sash that seems to be based off of a kente cloth, which if you didn't know is just a type of African textile that has a long, over 1,000-year history, and is almost always decorated with these elaborate geometric patterns and colors. In the case of this cloth, the colors it's mostly made up of are orange, blue, yellow, maroon, and black. Maroon being the color of healing, thus it's associated with Mother Earth, black being the color of funeral rite, blue is the color of peace and harmony, and since I couldn't find any definition for orange, I'm going to assume it's the same as yellow, which is the color of purity and beauty. So I think this was done on purpose in order to identify Annette as a freedom fighter for slaves' rights. The rest of her aesthetic is leaning more towards 17th century European aesthetic, and is also pretty masculine because it features the combination of a fitted vest, loose blouse, black breeches, and boots. More casual clothing that was associated with men. It allows her more freedom of movement since she doesn't have to worry about constricting materials like silk or taffeta like women's clothing would. The outfit composition overall is made up of a lot more cleaner lines, as we can see from how the vest hugs her body, and it's straight and slim throughout, as we can see from her breeches down to her tanned boots, which was probably done to create more of a variance in its shape because her sleeves are more balloon-like. All of these Haitian and Yoruba elements tie into her magic system, which appears to be a combination of West African and Haitian voodoo magic. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Veve or Vive are the incantations that she uses in order to summon Iwa, the spirits or deities that she uses to channel her magic, which explains the reason why she was able of channeling the spirit of Papa Legba, who is literally considered the conduit that humans use to speak to the god, and because of her father's bloodline, she inherited the ability to summon Ogun. By channeling Ogun's abilities, she can manipulate the iron deposits in the earth so that she can create weaponry, as we can see here from these twin blades. As we can see from her fierce expressions, Annette is a child of war who has been forged in fire. She is a woman who has known nothing but struggle, and it has molded her into an aspirational yet inspirational figure. And that's it for today's character design analysis. Let me know how I did in the comments. And up next is Tera, Maria's mom. See you guys next time. Sluts, I'm back again with another character design analysis for the cast of Castlevania Nocturne, featuring the entire reason why Maria looks like an angel. And did I fucking stutter because I'm so fucking glad that Maria took after Tera more than she did her dad. Let's get to the brass tacks of things. Maria's character design tells me that she is the single mother of the year. Now, because Tera used to be a part of the nomadic speakers group, she's able of using their magic. And in honor of this lineage, she wears her blue speaker robes wrapped around her black knee-length skirt. Aside from that, the majority of her outfit is very neutral and monochromatic toned because it's only consistent of brown and black, some blue being splashed in there in order to add not only an icy counterpart to Maria's more warm and spring color palette, but again to denote her connection to the speakers in this iteration. I can't help but think that this was also done in order to paint her as a tragic character, as we see later on. seeing as how blue not only stands for magic in this universe, but also calm and sadness, which I think is further backed up by how she wears mostly black, and her cuffs also sort of resemble raven feathers with the way that they're sliced up. Overall, she appears very matronly because of how little skin she's showing and because of her soft silhouette. Like, obviously the brown underbust corset calls a lot of attention to her hourglass face. And may I just say, I need the diet and skincare routine stat on my desk at 12 a.m. With the way that she has her former speaker robes wrapped around her skirt, it kind of adds like this bouffant soft layering that mimics the skirt of ball gowns that you would see on French noblewomen. And it cascades down into these graceful folds before it cuts off at the widest part of the skirt, only to be tapered down to the sleekness of her boots. I think also the wide balloon shape of her sleeves helps to accentuate this as well, because again it adds even more soft curves to her design, which of course is found in abundance with her hair because that's exactly where Maria got all of the cute little curls from. But of course, as we can see with the main difference between these two women, Maria has very soft, petite, and exaggerated anime features, whereas with Maria, her features are more square and rounded in order to indicate that she's a mature woman. Thus, there are more lines around her lips and eyes to show that she has wrinkles, and she even has smaller and sharper eyes that have kind of a gentle downward tilt that make her look kind but not exactly passive, as we can see from how her brows look engaged and straight. I think in the case of Maria, she was designed to kind of have like the badass energy of Sypha, while also the soft maternal instinct of a mother. And yeah, that's it for today's character design analysis, and tomorrow we'll be doing a very popular fan request, Drolta. See you guys there. Trump's deportation orders haven't gotten to me yet, so I'm back again with another character design analysis for the cast of Castlevania Nocturne, featuring the woman who is making my moral compass disappear. After watching season 2, my boyfriend said that they basically buried Drolta in her club outfit, and I have not been able to get that out of my fucking head. Which is ironic considering that she is an Egyptian woman who turned into a vampire, and she has the most anachronistic fit out of everyone in the series. She's almost always seen in some type of two-piece leather ensemble with high heels and a black pink or a black red color palette, with purple to kind of create this gradient effect, as we can see from her hair here on her character sheet. Since her divas are always front and center and she always has this beguiling smile, it's supposed to show us that not only is she a seductress, but she is a very confident seductress at that, with a side of cold cruelty, which is demonstrated very well by all of the sharp features in her design, such as her thigh-high boots, her mandatory vampire acrylics, the sharp elven vampire ears, and her sharp eyes. And of course, because she's worked herself up in the vampire food chain, that allows herself the status to dress in multiple outfits, as we've seen from seasons 1 to 2. All of which always follow the same Drolta recipe of flaunting her sex appeal as much as possible. To be honest, the reason why I think her fashion sense is anachronistic is because it's supposed to show that she's not really attached to a specific timeline. The only time that she ever was attached to a specific timeline was when she was still a human. So even though Nocturne is based off of 18th century France, Drolta is over here wearing a leather top with a plunging neckline that is fashioned to vaguely resemble a corset, but more so it looks like something from the early 2000s, with leather heelless boots that look like something straight out of a dominatrix closet, and the mandatory vampire cloak has been fashioned into a diva drape. She legit looks like a fashion model meets Dommy Mommy, who surprisingly carries herself a lot like a leader despite priding herself on being the #1 follower. And her color palette does a good job of capturing this too, because it's more of a light take on the black and red combo, since pink is a color that's more delicate, associated with love and passion, rather than red, which is the more vibrant counterpart to pink and is more so associated with bloodlust, war. But then black is a somber and elegant color which stands in stark contrast to red and pink. Therefore, I think that the black is supposed to paint Drolta as this mysterious yet elegant figure, but the pink is added to her design to show that she can be playful yet cruel. No matter what type of version we're getting of Drolta, so be it her regular form or this vampiric form, there's always this interplay of dangerous allure going on with her design, because even if she has pink fire for hair and devil horns and wings, a motif that is also translated into the cuff of her boots to resemble bat wings, Drolta's clothing will always be styled around her other source of pride, her beauty. By the way, can we just talk about how funny it is that she moves on from these boots to hooves? And that's it for today's character design analysis. Up next is Alucard. I'll see you guys then. Greetings, monster fuckers. I'm back again with another character design analysis for the cast of Castlevania Nocturne, featuring the Eternal Third Wheel. Now, before we dive into the comparison between Castlevania and Castlevania Nocturne's Alucard, we gotta go back to the basics, because Ayami Kojima is who we have to thank for Castlevania's art direction. From the very beginning, he was always made out to be this ethereal being, almost angelic with European-coded features. Almost aggressively European if you ask me. He has very pale skin, pale blonde hair, and he dresses in fashion that I would say was typical for a 15th century nobleman. For example, he wears his black cape with white lining with a dramatic collar, that is secured by silver pins to his military-style gold and black coat. That, of course, is adorned with frogging, otherwise known as a style of fastening which is made up of cords that are braided into this elaborate pattern. And in classic nobleman fashion, he wears a jabot, otherwise known as a neckerchief, which is used in order to keep your undershirt clean. And of course, because rich people love their layers, he's wearing another black and silver coat underneath the black and gold coat that comes with silver buckles that match the silver accessories of his outer coat. And to tie it all together, he's wearing a pair of what looks like leather breeches with black and white cuffed medieval boots. For some reason, when it comes to nobility, they really fucking love their cuffs, as we can see from the exaggerated gold cuffs of his jacket as well as his boots. And I think this was likely done in order to not only shorten the overall length of the coat sleeve and the boot, but to also provide additional cover to the sleeves or the pants of the wearer, and honestly to probably allow a lot more space for any ornate designs, as we can see from the gold pattern on his cuffs. And as for his color scheme, Alucard is made up of gold, black, silver, and a little bit of yellow. This is all made in order to show that he's a delicate and almost ethereal inhuman being, while also grounding him in a level of sophistication thanks to the black. However, the gold and silver also adds a certain level of opulence to him, except the gold adds more warmth, which I say is from his human qualities, and the silver is more of his vampiric qualities. Thus, it kind of makes him this detached figure, but not overtly so. So when you cobble all of that together, you end up getting this very elven-coated character who fights with a slender blade to exaggerate his grace, because I definitely think that they were trying to make Alucard look more bishonen and small in comparison to his father Dracula. We can all accept here that the long princely locks are supposed to be a reflection of his status, but I think it's also another way of showing how he's kind of closer to Lisa, his mother's side, seeing as how he's a Dhampir who fights on behalf of humanity. However, I would say that the jump from Castlevania to Castlevania Nocturne makes Alucard appear a lot more inhuman, because the style of Castlevania itself is your regular bread and butter dark fantasy style. In the case of Alucard specifically, the characters have these very long oval-shaped faces that end with an inverted triangle point for a jaw, and a long narrow nose that's typical of European features, with very skinny yet wide and sharp defined eyes. Of course, in the case of Alucard, I think that's supposed to be more of his father's features that are then countered by his mother's softer features, as we can see from the waves in his hair. Now, Castlevania Nocturne is almost a complete 180 of that style. I believe that it leans much more heavily into Ayami Kojima's style, as instead of rendering the characters in these thin yet bold black lines that have almost this clean and consistent width throughout, Castlevania Nocturne likes to render their characters in these very thin, delicate, and somewhat detached lines. Especially if you look closely at the second image of Castlevania Nocturne Alucard, we can see that he has more colored lines in order to show the highlights in his hair, kind of to help add a glow to his design. Proportions of his face have even changed dramatically, because now it's less long and more wide and short. His jawline ends with a more rounded chin. Basically, it looks like Alucard if you took out all of his rhinoplasty. Overall, I would say that Alucard is the perfect example to choose for the change in art style from Castlevania to Castlevania Nocturne, mostly because he's the only one alive from the original cast, but also because I believe that Alucard was the blueprint, the bread and butter for Castlevania's future art direction. That's it for today's character design analysis. I yapped on for long enough, and next time we'll be covering Olrox. See you guys there. Hello, I'm back again with another character design analysis on the cast of Castlevania Nocturne, featuring the traitor. Why the fuck is Mizrak just... Olrox is the vainest and flashiest take on 18th century men's fashion, specifically 18th century men's fashion among French noblemen, because it's the same type of men's coat that we've seen time and time again in period pieces, but it's specifically composed of a vest, jabot, a frock coat, just a catch-all term for formal men's coats that end at the knee, which he pairs with a matching set of breeches, you know, like those short pants that end at the knee, tights, and loafers with a gaudy buckle. It's very much giving 1-2 buckle my shoe, all of which is colored with gold, white, and purple. Purple being the gaudiest color of them all because it's a color that's associated with royalty and opulence. And gold is even more so associated with opulence, seeing as how it's a very precious metal. And then when you pair gold with white, you get a holy color combination that is typically associated with Christian gods. Thus, you're imbuing yourself with like this sense of perceived holiness. And rule of thumb, but typically for these types of clothing, whenever they're more restrictive and impractical, that typically means that they're favored among the ruling class, seeing as how they don't have to bother with labor like the rest of us poors. The pride and arrogance is radiating off of this man. He's standing with one hand on his hip and his head up, smiling in this all-knowing way, like as if he always has the upper hand over the other person. And because his eyebrows have these really sharp corners, it matches his eyes well. Corners of which also end at a short angle, kind of giving it this trapezoidal shape that is then better captured by how tiny his eyes are. Now I'm making his voice actor sound like an asshole because that's who Olrox is based off of, who, if you didn't know, is a native Native American man, and it carried over very clearly to Olrox's appearances. Olrox has the wide face, the full jawline, the high cheekbone. I think the detail of his that's even more interesting than that are his lime green eyes. Because even though green and purple are giving me a Maleficent vibe, I like how green makes him snake-like in my eyes because it makes him look like this very poisonous, venomous creature. Character association, which I think makes perfect sense for him because he is a corruptor. But of course, because this man is so vain, I also think that this was done intentionally in order to match his earrings, which just also happens to match his pocket watch fob that we can see coming down from his vest on the left-hand side. If there's anything that Olrox is known for, it's making a statement. He keeps his long black hair straight and conditioned. With the way that the lapel of his coat and his cuffs are shining, I want to say that it's made of real gold. I like to say that Olrox is the outlier in all of the events of Castlevania Nocturne, and he's an incredibly selfish person who doesn't really have a higher purpose beyond fulfilling his immediate desires. And that's it for today's character design analysis. We'll be getting back to a couple more requests, so I'll see you guys there. Bonjour horrors, I'm back again with another character design analysis for the cast of Castlevania Nocturne, featuring repressed homosexuality. Because Mizrak is part of a religious faction, he was designed to be the complete opposite of Olrox. The religious order in particular being a Catholic military faction called the Knights of the Hospital of the Order of St. John, which is a legitimate group from history whose main goal was to basically provide aid to the poor, specifically the Catholic type, but you know what I mean. And Mizrak's armor is basically a more fantastical adaptation of their uniform, which always consists of an 8-point white cross that is always set against a plain and somber color scheme of gray, white, and black. And of course, because the cross is the centerpiece of the uniform, it's in white, which is another color associated with purity. This religious group would later be called the Hospitaller Knights, which is what I'll be referring to them from here on. The reason why I say Mizrak has a more fantastical interpretation is because he has a black cavalier cape, which if you didn't know is the official name for those capes that are always worn diagonally over one shoulder. In terms of the military, it's supposed to signify that someone is of higher status, so in the case of Mizrak, it's denoting that he is a general or a commander. And even though it's a flamboyant take on capes, your sword arm is supposed to be exposed, allowing for you to quickly reach for your sword in the event there's an attack. Another reason why I say this is fantastical is because it's kinda cunty. Like, Mizrak is wearing the surcoat and everything, and if you didn't know, a surcoat is basically a sleeveless tunic that knights typically wear. It's supposed to have some type of insignia in order to denote who you belong to. I want to say that there is a practical explanation for it because the slits allow for him to have better movement. Seeing as how the traditional surcoat can sometimes go down to the ankles of the wearer, so I would say that's much more restrictive. But I do think this is meant to show off his muscular body, seeing as how he's a battle monk. And we can see that there are other practical elements to his design, such as the chainmail that he wears underneath the surcoat. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, we can also see that he has a pair of QCs, otherwise known as thigh armor, which typically has a gap in order to allow for greater mobility so that you don't have like armor plates hitting each other. And of course, because this is someone who has probably ridden into battle on horseback, he has a pair of knee-high riding boots. Now, if we look at Mizrak's face specifically, we can see it's made up of a lot of geometric shapes in comparison to Olrox, who has these rounded yet more sharp angles. Mizrak's face is quite literally carved out into these very strong straight planes, as we can see from the shape formed by his facial hair. And even though he does have a beard, it is quite short and clean cut, much like his hairstyle, which is legit just a low taper fade, but it's obviously kept short because he's very low maintenance when it comes to his appearance, which is even carried onto the shape of his eyebrows that look like these thick, sharp, rectangular pieces, with a little cut likely to indicate that this was the result of a previous battle injury. And even though he has the formulaic sharp Castlevania eyes, it has more of a trapezoidal shape to it, which cradles his brown iris, not necessarily giving him a sharp appearance, but more so steady and rigid. But going back to what I initially said about how Mizrak is Olrox's complete opposite in every way, it's in order to play up their dynamic and how there is this incessant push and pull between Olrox and Mizrak, and specifically with Mizrak and how he's fighting with his feelings for Olrox. Now, even though Olrox dresses himself in these very sensuous soft fabrics colored in this gaudy purple, the fact that we hardly ever see Mizrak without his armor shows that he only knows how to be a dedicated Catholic boy. Surprisingly sensitive because this boy is literally crying every other second on screen, which further adds on to the duplicitous nature of his character design, because even though he seems to be the perfect example of a God-fearing Catholic, he is still very human on the inside. And that's it for today's character design analysis. Up next, we'll be doing a couple more requests, so I'll see you guys next time. Hello you sluts, today we'll be doing a character design analysis request for Carmilla from Castlevania. Now this could just be me, but I always felt like Carmilla had an oddly modern design because it looks like she's wearing a floor-length gown that's from the 2010s. The cut is all about enhancing her physical beauty by showing off her cleavage, where she always has a deep plunging neckline, her back, her legs. Always these dramatic and sharp cuts in the dress, which are probably meant to enhance her sharp features such as her cheekbones, as well as her sharp-ass acrylics. Regardless of the situation, Carmilla is almost always wearing some type of formal wear, because she is the self-proclaimed ruler of all vampires and the Queen of Styria. As we had discussed earlier, this choice in clothing is not only meant to enhance her natural beauty, but it's also meant to show her status. Red and gold color scheme is also another thing that remains consistent in Carmilla's fashion. The red obviously being a representation of two different qualities to Carmilla. Her self-perceived sense of royalty, because red being such a strong color is something that was also favored by nobles, much like Prussian blue. And gold, which is obviously because it is a precious metal, so it is used to indicate someone's worth. And to further push the opulence of the gold, it's almost always worked into these Art Nouveau-like designs. Aesthetic movement, which if you didn't know, is supposed to mimic the unpredictable yet beautiful swirling lines of nature. Attention to detail, of course, doesn't only apply to her dress pauldrons, but also to her other accessories, such as her shoes and her bracelets. Because gold is a warm color much like red, it also plays off of it very well, and it even makes her look and feel more like an open flame, which perfectly captures her personality. I've always felt like Carmilla had this very sinister approach to sensuality. She has a commanding presence, which is communicated very well through her posing, as we can see from how she always has her head tilted up and her arm held up, like as if she's commanding her subjects. And honestly, I do think that the heels capture that quality of hers very well, as heels were historically worn by men and then later women in order to give them a taller figure, further differentiate themselves from the masses, and to literally make it look like they're above you. Because it is an impractical shoe and very difficult to move around in, I think it's another way of showing how highly Carmilla thinks of herself. She has the privilege of prioritizing her looks over her functionality. In terms of physical looks, she literally looks like what you would think of whenever you imagine a vampire. To contrast her warm color scheme of red and gold, her physical traits are pale skin, white hair, and blue eyes. Instead of giving her this impression of being a passive and calm individual, it makes her look like this unapproachable goddess, especially because she has such long, silky white hair, and extremely sharp, hooked eyebrows with sharp hawk eyes. And the red lips play off of this so well because it gives her this crimson sheen that looks like she just finished feeding on someone. And when set against such a light skin tone, it almost looks alarming because of how much it resembles just raw blood. All in all, Carmilla's a bad bitch and I really miss her. That's it for today's character design analysis. I'll be doing a couple more requests, so I'll see you guys then. Bye! Hello maggots, I'm back again with another character design analysis request for the cast of Castlevania, featuring the woman with the bewitching pussy. When I tell you that Lenore was the problematic baddie of the year when the last season of Castlevania dropped, when she comes on scene, she's surprisingly delicate in comparison to the other vampires we've witnessed, a large part of that due to the fact that she doesn't have a lot of outward vampiric features, a design choice that was done intentionally in order to disarm both the viewer and Isaac. For example, Lenore is the smallest and shortest out of the Council of Sisters. She always drapes her small, delicate frame in these large, billowing figures like as if she's a delicate creature. Much like Carmilla, the majority of her closet is made up of dresses. Whereas Carmilla's dresses always have these dangerous cuts that show off her back, her cleavage, her leg, Lenore's dresses always conservatively cover up her arms, her legs, and oftentimes they are always layered with these other accessories or articles of clothing, such as this hooded mantle cloak. Mantle cloak just being another name for a cloak that has an additional capelet attached to it that opens down the front. Sometimes she also incorporates a thin veil in order to add another layer of modesty without putting too much weight on her small frame. Lenore was definitely designed to look like the princess out of the Council of Sisters, that due in part to her role as the diplomat of the team. And because of a diplomat, that lends her to having a much more duplicitous and manipulative approach to her enemy, whereas the rest of her sisters rely on brute strength. According to the character designer's notes, they tried to capture the droopy-eyed, doll-like aesthetics of Ayumi Kojima woman, and of course the pale soft skin, the tiny nose, chin, and mouth. In particular, I think what really sells Lenore's appearance is how many soft, curvy lines she has in her design. For example, we can see the majority of that being in her flaming orange lock, which even though they do look naturally wavy, they end in these articulated curls, especially the bangs around her face. Again, I just think that this goes to demonstrate how she is the hard opposite to Carmilla. There are some basic aesthetics that do tie them together as sisters, especially when we look at Lenore's jewelry, because Lenore's jewelry basically looks like liquid silver that's cut into these dangerous shapes. We can see from the jagged corners of her belt, as well as her hairpiece and her necklace, thus reminding us that Lenore is not some weak pushover just because she doesn't escalate things to violence. If anything, this careful balancing act of dainty female features and dangerous accessories and line work helps to remind us that that Lenore is incredibly good at reading people and projecting the exact image that will disarm them. Reason why, again, I believe she's dressed in all of these finer, softer materials like ribbons as we can see on her boots, the translucent mesh of her capelet and cloak, as well as the ruffles of her petticoat that we can see in the left image. And in terms of her posing, she always carries herself like this graceful princess. Matter of fact, she never exaggeratingly sticks out her arms, and she almost always keeps them to herself. Matter of fact, she usually keeps her hands clasped together, making her frame appear even more narrow, and to almost give her this weightless appearance like as if she's a specter. And I think her color scheme also really helps us sell that too, because she has, again, the complete opposite of Carmilla's color palette, which is made up of white, blue, and silver. The fiery orange, of course, that represents her hidden malicious intent, being in stark contrast to her royal icy color palette of blue and white. Which is why I believe her design incorporates so many Victorian elements, but she also feels like a figure straight out of Raphaelite era painting. Raphaelite being a term for a person who's part of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, where they were interested in bringing back the Italian Renaissance, which of course involved the dramatic depiction of figures from history and myth, but in a bright and lush style that also focused a lot on the beauty of nature. Whereas women are typically depicted as set dressing in a lot of paintings, Raphaelite art focused a lot on depicting the silent strength of woman. So when I saw this painting of Lady Lilith, I couldn't help but think of Lenore. It's the pale skin, the orange hair, the blushing lips, romantic coloring, it all just very much seems Lenore-esque. That's it for today's character design analysis. I've yapped on for long enough, and up next is Erzebet Batory. I'll see you guys then. Hello my fellow infidels, I'm back again with another character design analysis on the cast of Castlevania Nocturne, featuring the most dangerous Hear Me Out. Erzebet Batory's design is so interesting because she is a combination of Sekhmet, Carmilla, and well, Erzebet Batory, a Hungarian noblewoman who allegedly killed hundreds of women and young girls, allegedly bathing in the blood of virgins in order to preserve her youthful appearance. Thus, it has inspired a lot of vampiric tales. Carmilla being the titular lesbian vampire of the 1872 Gothic novella, and Sekhmet obviously being the Egyptian goddess that we saw mentioned in the show, who was also the representation of war and pestilence and flames. Cobble all of this together and we get an incredibly vain, violent, and wrathful character. Erzebet has always been a very confident and prideful woman who believed that she was a goddess on Earth, which is very well demonstrated by her towering height. I want to say she's like 7 feet tall, and she's always dressed richly in order to reflect her background, as we can see here from her bronze and navy blue gown. The high collar placing a great emphasis on her height, as well as broadening her shoulders in order to give her a wider, more exaggerated silhouette. It is complemented by the extreme hourglass tapering of her ball gown, as we can see from her cinched waist, and then the way it forms a bell-shaped pattern when we get to the hoop skirt. Now her hair, which is giving more open flame or onion root, is the complete antithesis of the very tight braided updos of the 15th and 16th century. Thus that adds another extremely scandalous layer to her design, not to mention the plunging keyhole neckline. Because this woman's element is clearly fire as a way to demonstrate her connection to Sekhmet, in order to capture her violent bloodlust, we can see that there is a gem that is in the shape of a fire almost on her chest. For her other accessory, which appears to be a bronze diadem that matches the rest of the dress, it's attached just to her forehead. It adds this very unrealistic edge to her design while also keeping with the sharper shapes of her design. And again, I think it's a very good way of demonstrating her arrogance, because she kind of styles herself as a sort of queen of vampires in this case. Now, as for her ball gown, I want to say that it's inspired by the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, because her outfits are clearly trying to scale off of her huge figure, as we can see from the sleeves that transition from puffy shoulder pads to tight sleeve. I think all of the hardware is supposed to make her resemble a building as much as possible. Of course, like every other vampire, she has the exact same pointed ears, the sharp eyes, but I would say that what makes her more terrifying compared to the other vampires is how she is seemingly emotionless, and her completely white skin makes her look even more dead, the black lips only adding a strong contrast to the skin in addition to her eyes. The Sekhmet/Egyptian themes are even more apparent, as we can see from the sun circle on the back of her head, the lion-shaped features that we can see from her black flat nose as well as her eyes, obviously the red hair that now flares out kind of like a lion's mane, and the fact that her girdle, both the front and back, now heavily resembles stylized Egyptian wings. There is striking gold line work that separates each of the wings in this perfect geometric formation that can then be tied back to her blue and yellow cape, which of course carries over a very similar silhouette from the gown that we had analyzed prior, except the difference now is that this gown is trying to flaunt her powerful physique as much as possible, since it's basically a cape attached to a bustier, and her massive back muscles are on full display, thus showing that she is a much stronger version. And I do think it's very interesting how from the very beginning Erzebet had a very Egyptian color palette, especially a color scheme that perfectly represents Sekhmet, because the colors of blue, gold, and white don't necessarily index to wealth or royalty like in Western terms. Blue in this case is supposed to represent water, abundance, and fertility. Thus you can say blue represents life, and yellow, because it represents the sun, is connected to gods as well as eternity. Thus, you can say it's a very arrogant way of claiming that you are unstoppable, and in complete and utter irony, white is supposed to represent purity and sacredness. Erzebet Batory has the most arrogant character design in all of Castlevania, in my opinion. The whole point of her design is supposed to liken her to a god reborn, and I think it's so interesting to see how she is just a composite of 3 different people. And anyway, I've yapped on for long enough. That's it for today's character design analysis, and up next is Trevor. I'll see you guys then. Hello all, today we're back again with another character design analysis request for Trevor from Castlevania. Starting in season 1, Trevor has a very classic kind of barbarian slash thief fit. Overall, we can see that the sleeves and waist of his tunic are very tight to his body. He has a pretty slim, narrow fit until you get down to the cuffs of his boots, and the chunky mid-waist belt that seems to have a red cloak sticking out of it, which shows his natural muscular figure without making it overtly masculine. And part of the reason why I say he has kind of a barbarian leaning design is because there's a lot of natural elements in it, as we can see from the cuffs of his gauntlets, which are lined with fur, and the gauntlets themselves seem to be made of leather with leather strapping. And in terms of his alternate accessories, as we can see from the asymmetrical scarf that's coming out of one of the cross straps, it's either detailed in fur or leather and fur. There's also an interesting amount of X's in his design. I can't help but think it's likely due to denote that he's an exile from his family, and that it's likely meant to be practical as well in order to allow for him to hang more accessories and weapons off of him, as we can see from the daggers on the left-hand side. Now, the best way I can describe this outfit is that it represents Trevor's shame. Even though it does look pretty cool and tactical and rugged, especially with the way that he's popping that fucking collar, he's not really proudly wearing the colors of the Belmont clan like he would later on. Rather, it just looks like he has scraps and remnants of a Belmont uniform that's slung over a regular civilian uniform. For example, the red waist cloak and the cross straps that are attached to the black and gold pauldrons all actually look like they're part of the Belmont uniform, especially when we get to this outfit that has a much more dominant color palette in later seasons. Like, yes, Trevor does keep the grayish trousers, but we can see that he takes more pride in his role as a Belmont vampire hunter, especially from the red and black cloak. A cloak being an easy indicator of status because it's supposed to be an additional layer of clothing that typical people wouldn't be able to afford, especially when it's dyed in the very serious yet passionate color combination of black and red. But I do like how the tips of the cloak do have additional detailing to make it look a little worn, thus to show that Trevor is still an adventurer through and through. In this design in particular, we see that he's done away with a lot of the animal traits of his previous uniform, seeing as how he no longer has the fur-lined cuffs. But he still keeps the overall sharp silhouette of the popped collar as well as the pointed shoulder pauldrons. The design of the uniform itself is also a lot more cohesive because his black tunic now also looks like it's attached to a fold, otherwise known as thigh or hip armor. But in order to not inhibit his speed or agility, it looks like it's made out of leather rather than metal. Trevor's always been an extremely reckless fighter, so it wouldn't really make sense for him to suddenly trade in his speed for more defense, which is why he still sticks to wearing light trousers with knee-high boots. And I find it very interesting how in a lot of his official character design sheets, we can see that he takes up a much more aggressive personality, even though this dude is not above shit and dick jokes. If anything, I think this was meant to play off of his initial rough and gruff persona, as we can see from his long, windswept, spiky hair that doesn't really sit upright, which I think is a good balance between him being a more mature and masculine figure, who can also be kind of a lazy, underhanded rogue. And I think the stubble is also meant to play into his whole battle hobo aesthetic, and yes, it highlights his sharp-ass jawline even more, but it also shows that this is not a well-manicured man who just stays indoors all day, which of course is even more backed up by the scar. Overall, I think it's really interesting how Trevor maintains most of his personality, that being a dude who just loves to drink all day, have sex. He kind of goes through a third puberty almost, where he has a renewed sense of purpose. And I just think that's all translated really well into his design. And that's it for today's character design analysis. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And up next is Isaac. See you guys there. Bonjour bitches, I'm back again with another character design analysis request for Isaac from Castlevania. Isaac, much like Hector, is clad in the traditional Forge Master uniform, specifically the one from one of the Castlevania manga titles, of which a title I do not remember off the top of my head. But here is his original appearance in that manga. Even though the very acts of a Forge Master is against the word of God, their attire is heavily inspired by cardinal vestments. Vestments basically being the official term to refer to the holy uniform of members of the clergy. Of course, the main difference here is that it has a much more slim and taper build, as we can see from the sleeves down to the skirt of his uniform. But we can see that it has the same basic hallmarks of the cassock. It is a long sleeve, very modest uniform. And like a traditional cassock, the Forge Master uniform also features a fascia, otherwise known as a waist sash, a high neck, and a skirt that extends well past the knees. And much like very common variations of the cassock, it is done in red and black. And in most cases, as we have discussed on this channel, black and red is supposed to be a very conflicting color combination that is passion meets somberness. However, in the case of the church, black is supposed to be a color that represents mourning, whereas red represents blood, the Holy Spirit, and sacrifice. Though of course, in the case of Thomas and Hector, and seeing as how they're Forge Masters who initially served Dracula, I would rather say that black and red is supposed to be a color combination that indicates their affiliation with Dracula, as well as the very smart, super fashionable, and very extra choice to have a pair of bat wings fashioned into the lapel. And much like Annette, Isaac also goes through a race swap. So rather than looking like your average Caucasian man like the rest of the Castlevania cast in the video game, Isaac now is a dark-skinned Muslim-coated man. I say Muslim-coated because I noticed that he was wearing something that resembles a thobe. And if you didn't know, because I fucking butchered the pronunciation of it, thobe refers to the long white, long-sleeved robes that you typically see practicing Muslim men wear. Because if you look closely at this beautiful blue and gold ensemble that he has going on, this outfit has all of the bearings of a thobe. It's long-sleeved, it's very conservative with a skirt that goes down past the knee. It even has the same neckline, except it's kind of split down the middle, making it honestly look less rigid and conservative and a little bit more stylish. Going back to Isaac's characterization, which is that of a very quiet and deeply contemplative man, the clean and careful way in which he carries himself also has a lot of the same hallmarks of Sufism, which is another branch of Islam that supports personal relationships with God. And it's so interesting to see how this manifests into his physical appearance, namely his bald-ass head, because this man really has no interest in his body outside of how much torture he can put it, as we can see from the long scars that seem to be self-inflicted, because I don't think this dude is beyond self-flagellation. But of course what belies his seemingly monk aesthetic is a personality full of wrath. I think it's really interesting how you can't really suss that out about Isaac aside from his eyes, because even though he does have the same characteristic sharp Castlevania eyes like the rest of the cast, looking at the intense shading around his eyes, he has very deep eye sockets that kind of make his eyes protrude more, and it further accentuates his brows, giving him this kind of dead fish appearance. Overall, the level of fear that Isaac inspires in me would make the Catholic Church jealous. Anyway, that's it for today's character design analysis. Up next is Dracula, and I'll see you guys next time. Hello bitches, I'm back again with another character design analysis request for Dracula from Castlevania. And if you're a father of one who's feeling like a piece of shit, worry not. Because Dracula is not just the king of vampires, but the king of multitasking at being a terrible father figure, and a mixture of inspirations ranging from Vlad the Impaler and Bela Lugosi's Dracula. But that's if we're talking about lore. In terms of appearance, he's 100% based off of Ayumi Kojima's rendition. He's made out to be literally this tall, dark figure clad in long, black, wavy hair, and facial hair that looks very similar to Vlad the Impaler's, except less disgusting, because instead of the thick cigar pedophile mustache, he has more of a small tapered gentleman's mustache and a goatee. But like any good vampire, he has all of the characteristic sharp angles, especially the cheekbones, the ears, the eyes, and even the eyebrows, as we can see how they're always angled and arched to look like as if he's angry, and then his eyes end in these sharp wolfish corners. And like any good vampire, he's dressed like a nobleman, except it's not really accurate to 15th century clothing, or at least the approximation of it within this universe. Because whereas Ayumi Kojima's version of Dracula has an ascot, a peak collar, a red and black coat with red lapels with elaborate embossing, Castlevania Dracula is a lot more sleek and subdued, as we can see literally from the notes in the lower left hand corner. The strong, straight silhouette that ends in these waves at the bottom of his cape is very Batman-like, and helps to sell the fact that he is this very large and imposing figure, which also builds up his mythos of being this very scary individual, which is a design intent that is further enhanced by all of the sharp triangular lines found throughout his silhouette. Because if we look closely at the hem of his vest, we can see that it's pointed downward like a straight arrow, which is again a repeating motif, as we can see from the design along the cuffs of his coat, as well as the cuff of his boots and the bottom of his coat. To carry on the association with death and despair, we can see that he maintains the color scheme of black, white, and red. White obviously to best capture his ghostly visage, as we can see from his extremely pale skin, another classic characteristic of vampires, but also to kind of add as like a break between the black and red. I would say that this color palette is a lot less lush in comparison to Ayumi Kojima's version, because there's a greater abundance of black in this design, and I would say that this shade of red, even though bright, looks less floral and bright in comparison to Kojima's version. It's strange to use the term romantic, but that's what I'm going to lean into, because instead of being more of a romantic figure like some something straight out of gothic horror. This Dracula instead looks like a very well-read man who has an extremely sinister side to him. Because of his distinguished posturing with how his back is straight and he always has his shoulders rolled back and his head tilted up and his feet are always together, it helps to not only narrow his silhouette, but it also helps to communicate how he was an originally very stern and stoic person, which is why I believe he has such strong geometric patterns found throughout his design. I just like how this version of Dracula takes back a lot of the bouffant layers of his Castlevania design to, ironically enough, make him feel more realistic in this grand setting. That's it for today's character design analysis. Let me know what you think in the comments, and up next is Sypha. See you guys there. The kidnappers were kind enough to return me, so I'm back again with another character design analysis on Sypha from Castlevania. She is also the most beautiful woman in the world. I don't make the rules, I just have a thing for mages. And when Sypha first graces the screen, we can see that that is apparent because she's wearing the uniform of the Seekers, an apolitical nomadic group of mages who wear unisex clothing in order to protect the identities of the woman. Therefore, Sypha kinda has this androgynous appearance because she wears blue and black robes that mostly cover up her figure. And even though this may appear to be heavy, on Sypha it's very light and airy, as we can see from the swallowtail cuts in the ends of the robes. Thus it ends with this triangular taper, and it makes it look like as if she's wearing blades of wind on her. Now obviously she's a small Caucasian woman with a very thin frame. I think that the way that the robes are layered really helps to enhance that because she wears a white bandage around her waist to not only secure her black salwar style pants, but to also add a skinny taper to her design, as we can see from how it hugs her waist very closely. Immediately we can tell that Sypha was never built for attack or defense. She was built to be a speedy magician. Yes, the robes are a dead giveaway since they're always associated with mages. Mages have always been a very conservative class that's based off of real-world scholars. I think another dead giveaway is also the fact that she doesn't really have any armor. In terms of her physical appearance, Sypha looks more fairy or nymph-like. She has these big blue eyes that obviously are meant to match the color scheme of the speaker's robes, which are black, blue, and white. They have these long feathery lashes that make her eyes look even more exaggerated and doll-like, which I think really suits the long wavy locks of her pixie cut. It's basically a short haircut that ends in like these curls that look windswept, which I think ties into the whole theme of her looking like air personified, but I think it also leans into making her look like a very dainty small creature. And in her subsequent designs, even though the speaker robes are scaled back, like she no longer has the high asymmetrical cowl or the long sleeve, because now they're trying to tell us that she's a more aerodynamic fighter, and she's also much less rigid now that she's met Trevor. She is still the same battle fairy who likes to prioritize speed. I also appreciate how she had a change in footwear because she went from wearing these brown strappy sandals to more sensible boots. Clearly because she took on a more active role against the vampire apocalypse, she would obviously need something that would be more sustainable in a fight and offer more support, hence the boots. And also, can I just say, even though this version of her outfit has more black than it does blue or white, they still maintain the same color scheme because Sypha is all about progressing the knowledge of the Seekers. But I gotta say, the black does make her look a lot more sleek. And the exposed shoulders with the scar on her right shoulder makes her look more battle-hardened, so I appreciate that. Even though I prefer the billowing robes of her first design. It's just very funny how Sypha's out here kind of looking like a European princess with a bit of a wild edge, but she is literally one of the smartest women in all of Castlevania with the power of a nuke. I love it. That's it for today's character design analysis. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I think that's it for all of our Castlevania requests. I'll probably be going back to Bleach after this. Comment below if you guys have any other requests, and I'll see you guys next time.